seconds, 500,000 tweets are tweeted every 60 seconds. There's just so much going on around us all the time, sort of like instantly. It's no wonder that sometimes we might feel a little overwhelmed. And while Nehemiah certainly lived in a deal, just a little bit overwhelmed, just the pressure of conducting business, for hiring, all of the resources of encouraging folks to be involved in the project, a little bit overwhelmed. Last week we left Nehemiah just getting ready to start on this project, and it seems not sure if he started that day or if he waited a week or a couple of weeks. Josephus, who's a Jewish historian who writes much later, claims that Nehemiah waited 25 years before he headed to Nehemiah started that journey. This in stealth mode and circles the walls and figures out exactly the problem, and then he reports back to those around him. He encourages them to get started, and that process gets started. On his way to Jerusalem, he meets a couple of guys with some interesting names, this guy named Sanballat and Tobiah, and right away Nehemiah realizes that Sanballat and Tobiah are going to be an issue. They're going to cause problems, and by the time we get to Nehemiah chapter 4 this morning, they've done just that. And as construction on the walls begins, they have experienced some success and some good things are happening against his enemies and for his enemies. And so Nehemiah leans on this prayer, and the people lean into their work, and they continue to build the wall. And as they continue to build the wall, Sanballat and Tobiah continue to sort of oppose the work. And when the taunts and the jeers and the discouragement isn't enough, they start to rally other people around them, and they start to prayer. And at the same time, he puts guards up. He gets to work in action with folks and says, the enemies continue to oppose the work and materials for the building of the wall on the other hand. And they work around the clock in that manner, just standing guard, being ready. No matter the opposition that faced Nehemiah, he kept serving. We can keep serving. We can keep serving our big God no matter the opposition we face. And I think that story in Nehemiah chapter 4, all 23 verses, it teaches us 3 reactions we ought to have to opposition. 3 reactions we ought to have when we face opposition doing God's work. If you have your Bible with you this morning, I'd encourage you to open it up to Nehemiah chapter 4. We're going to work our way through these 23 verses this morning as we consider 3 reactions that we ought to have to opposition when we face it. Nehemiah chapter 4, 3 reactions. We're going to work our way through these verses as we see. Nobody said serving him would be easy. Wall, he was angry and greatly enraged, and he jeered at the Jews. And he said in the presence of his brothers in the army of Samaria, "What are these feeble Jews doing?" And burned ones at that. Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, "Yes, what they are building." Just encounter Nehemiah. We're introduced to them if you go back to Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 9, just as Nehemiah enters the city, they're causing problems. He knows they're going to be an opponent to the work there, and their anger and resistance just sort of builds. You can kind of figure that out through chapter 2 and then again all the way through chapter 4. They just sort of get more and more angry. And Sanballat. And so you kind of get the sense. Each one of these questions just sort of gets more sarcastic as he goes. And of course, the last 4 all assume a no answer. He said, "What are these feeble Jews doing?" So he just digs the people. Take time to worship their God, or will they ever be able to return to worship of their God? This task is too big, in other words. Will they finish up in a day? Can they ever get this done? Will they revive the stones and the heaps of rubbish, the burned out ones at that. They're sort of ridiculing even the material that they're using. How ridiculous is it for them to reuse this destroyed walls and the burned out rocks and finally, Tobiah adds on, what they've gotten done, these walls that they've built, if a fox ran across it, this little animal ran across it, it would break down the walls. And they're just hurling these insults on them. Nobody promised that serving God would be easy. I don't know if you've ever positioned for it. If somebody said, hey, work you were doing. I remember many years ago, to seek some advice from this older preacher I knew and sat down with him one day. It was a long time ago. But this conversation and how he just started listening to a terrible idea. And to this day, I'm not sure on all these reasons, this discouragement that Nehemiah, that kind of opposition in your walk with Jesus, I can promise that it would be easy serving him. So how did Nehemiah react to this opposition? We get to verse 4. Hear, O God, for we are guilt, and let not their sin be blotted out from your sight, for they have provoked you to anger in the presence of the builder. So Nehemiah stops and he prays. Nehemiah is a person of prayer over and over already in the book of Nehemiah. We can see him that when trouble hits, his first reaction is going to be prayer. And there's nothing new about that here. Nehemiah stops and he prays. The thing that stands out to me about this prayer, though, is just how honest it is. I do think it gives us a fresh example here in the book of Nehemiah for our prayer lives. That when we face opposition, yes, absolutely, our first reaction ought to be to pray. I don't know about you, but sometimes that's almost the opposite for me. Things start to go bad, and I kind of lose contact. I lose touch with God instead of my first response being to turn to God. I sort of feel where I think, man, I don't know more spirituality. If I was a little closer to him, I wouldn't feel so prayer. Have you ever talked to God and you thought, well, I really want to say, I better clean this up a little bit? Think you're hearing? God is really big. He knows. If you read through the book of Psalms, you'll read over and over in Psalms these psalms of lament where the psalmist is just pouring out their heart, kind of cutting themselves open and revealing to God, man, these are the bad things that are going on in my life, and I'm fed up with them. I don't know what to do about them. Would you please hear me, God? There are Psalms, you maybe want to write these down and go check them out later, like Psalm 6 or 38, Psalm 10, 13, 17, 22, 25, 30, 31, 42 and 43, 69, 73, 80. Come across one of these poems, I'm having a rough time. What should I do? If you're in that spot and you're wondering, how do I talk to God about this? The first thing is so obvious. It's the hardest thing for me to do, though. Instead of sort of hiding from God, instead of feeling bad about feeling bad, turn to him. Go to God. Just like Nehemiah's example here, he stops and he talks to God. He starts to pray. And maybe the greatest prayer, the person who was absolutely the closest to God who ever walked this planet, Jesus, he sets this example too, doesn't he? Do you remember the prayer in the garden just before he goes to be crucified? That prayer is a brutally honest prayer, isn't it? It's the kind of say, man, if this cup can be taken from me, let's do that, God. I'm not looking forward to suffering on the cross. This kind of obvious hurt and anguish and anxiety that anybody would be experiencing, Jesus expresses in his prayer to God. And whomever it is, sugarcoat it. I promise you. He knows all. And cry out with your complaint, scholars will say, people more eloquent than me. I think what they're saying is spill your guts. Cry out with your complaint. Oh, and by the way, You can still trust that God is there, that he is going to respond. Ask him to hear, ask him to respond, and trust that he is going to stay close to you. Trust that he is hearing your prayer. And so Nehemiah stops, and then he prays, and we get to verse 6. So we built the wall. They just go back to work. And all the wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. That's an awesome verse that literally just means the people had a heart to work, that they wanted to serve God. And so in spite of, in face of this opposition, they continued to serve him. But when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites, so he's getting all the crowd together, heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward and that the breaches were beginning to be closed, they were very angry. Their anger and suspicion continues to build. And they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. And what does Nehemiah and the people do again in verse 9? And we prayed to our God. They prayed again. But they don't just pray, they step into action and set a guard as a protection against them day and night. In Judah it was said, the strength of those who bear the burdens is failing. There is too much rubble by ourselves. We will not be able to rebuild the wall. And our enemies said they will not know or see till we come among them and kill them and stop the work. At that time the Jews who lived near them came from all directions and said to us 10 times. I think what that means is, scholars think that what that means is that over and over they came and they said the same thing. If they said it once, they said it 1,000 times. That kind of statement. They came and they said it 10 times, you must return to us. So in the lowest parts of the space, behind the wall, in open places, I stationed the people by their clans with their swords, their spears, and their bows. Did you catch it? Nehemiah stopped and he prayed, and they went to work, and they found success, and they had a heart for service, and so that's what they did. And the opposition kept coming. And when the opposition came back, they prayed again, and they posted guards. And even though they prayed, and even though they took steps of faith, and even though they posted guards, the opposition continued until it started to kind of creep into people's minds. Maybe we can't do this. Maybe we can't come through. Maybe we're really not smart enough. Maybe we're really not strong enough. Maybe we really don't have the tools and the resources necessary. They kind of start to buy in a little bit to the opposition and the claims of them. And Nehemiah posts guards again. Man, I promise you that it won't be easy to serve him all the time. But nobody ever said it would be. It's reaction number one. Just to remember that nobody said serving him would be easy. Reaction number two is to remember that God is a big, big God. We get to verse 14. I just love verse 14 because that opposition keeps coming and people start to buy into it a little bit, and the fear factor kind of sinks in, and they start to wonder, can we really do this? Are we enough for God to use us? And Nehemiah, we get to verse 14, and this is what happens. Nehemiah said, and I looked and arose and said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. And I looked and arose. What that literally means is that Nehemiah looked out over the crowd. You know, he kind of surveyed what was going on. He walked around and he had conversations with folks, and he realized there's some serious doubt amongst the workers here. We're not sure if we can do this. He hung out with the people. We're a little bit like a broken record here at Wallula sometimes, but it's why we do these small groups. Our small groups are just kicking off for the winter and spring. If you're not a part of a small group, you ought to get in one of those. It's kind of the tool that we utilize to stand up and to look out and to see what's going on in the crowd. Nehemiah somehow made his way through, and he took the temperature of his workforce. He took the temperature of the servants there. And small groups are the very best way here at Wallula Christian Church for us to do that, for us to look out for one another, just like Nehemiah was looking out for his workforce. And so I looked and arose, and he said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome. Don't be afraid of the opposition, of the people who've been in jail for a while, and the leaders bring them out and they say, okay, we're going to let you go, but what we need you to do is just to stop talking about Jesus. This happens in Acts chapter 4. Do you remember Peter and John's response? Peter speaks up for the both of them, and they said, look, here's the deal. You do what you want to do, but we have to obey God rather than men. We will fear God, but we're not going to fear you. And so you do what you want to do, but we have to obey God. And there's no way we're going to stop talking about Jesus. Nehemiah says the same thing. Look, fear people. Fear God, but don't fear people. Worry about what God thinks. Don't worry about what people think and what they can do. It's not that Nehemiah doubts the opposition. It's not that Nehemiah is downplaying the danger. In fact, Jesus says it in sort of the same way in Matthew chapter 10, verse 28. He's talking about the fact that persecution will come, and he just spends a little time reassuring his disciples. And this is what he says to them in Matthew chapter 10, verse 28. He says, and do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Comforting, isn't it? Did you catch it? What does Jesus say? He says essentially, look, the worst thing that can happen is that you'll die. Well, yeah. Comforting, isn't it? We were on vacation a while ago, and we took this ride, a little ride up a chairlift up a mountain. And it's the kind of activity that you do once in a while on vacation. You've done this sort of thing. Maybe it was a zip line or some kind of roller coaster, or something more crazy than that, or bungee jumping or whatever. And you sign up and you pay your money, and then they say, we need you to check this box, and you check the box almost without considering it. And if you would take time to read what you've just checked, the last line is, but don't forfeit your soul on the way. Right? Pay attention to what really matters for all of eternity in the one who holds eternity in his hand. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome. Don't forget that we serve this big, big God. I had this conversation with a friend of mine, and I knew he had been struggling a little bit and had been going through some health things. I didn't realize kind of how serious those health things were. And in the course of this conversation, he said, look, this is where I'm at with my health, but we just have to keep going. Besides, they've told me I should have been dead 3 times already. And you could just sense the faith. It's not that he didn't understand the opposition. It's not that he didn't understand the risk or the end result or whatever. It's just that I'm not drawing breath in you to serve. And that's what Nehemiah says to these folks. He asks them, in short, to be bold. You go back to that story in Acts chapter 4. Peter and John are released from jail because the religious leaders, they don't know what else to do. Right? It's clear they're not going to shut up, and it's clear that because of the miracle that was performed, the people are sort of on their side, and so they're left without any choice, and they release Peter and John, and Peter and John go to a prayer meeting sort of straight away. Do you know what they prayed at this prayer meeting in Acts chapter 4? God, give us boldness to proclaim your name. Right? Don't let us shrink. Don't let us fear people. Help us to fear you and to serve you no matter what, to keep going no matter what, to remember that you are a God who is a big God who can make a way. Man, I want to pray for bold enough to take those steps of faith. Faiths are guaranteed tomorrow. None of us know when our time of service is going to come to an end. And so live like it. It's really reaction number 3, by the way, that is just to live like you know that God is big. Act like God is really the big God that you claim He is. Goes on in verse 15 here in Nehemiah chapter 4 to say, when our enemies heard that it was known to us that God had frustrated their plan, we all returned to the wall. I love this. You can kind of combine it with verse 6 a little earlier. So we built the wall. They pray. They turn this over to God, and they get back to work. They just continue to serve and to get after what God has in store for them. We talked last week about the different ministry teams here at Wallula and these Wallula One ads that are still on that back table. Had a few people reach out to me, grateful for that. And coming up in February, on the 16th, on February, there's going to be this ministry team. Or that's Explore Wallula. You can come to that and figure that out. The next month will be our ministry team fair. And so we want you to come and hear and sign up to participate. But don't outside of Wallula, to just continue to serve Him, to act like God is really big. That's what the people did here. They got back to work in verse 15. From that day on, half my servants worked on construction and half held the spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. And the leaders stood behind the whole house of Judah who were building on the wall. Those who carried burdens were loaded in such a way that each labored on the work with one hand and held his weapon with the other. Depending on how you hands, they carried material enough that they could carry only in one hand, so that they had one hand available for their sword, available to fight, or maybe half carried and half worked. It kind of depends on how you exactly translate that. But some were busy doing the building, and some were busy standing guard, or maybe kind of half and half. And each of the builders had his sword strapped at his side while he built. The man who sounded the trumpet was beside me. They could rally to one spot far from one another. In the place where you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally us there. Our God will fight for us. Our God is big enough. So we labored at the work, and half of them held the spears and from the break of dawn until the stars came out. That's typically the workday ended when the sun set, and they kind of kept going and working by starlight. They were so devoted to this project. I also said to the people at the time, let every man and the servant pass the night within Jerusalem, that they may be. One of us took off our clothes, each kept his weapon at his right hand. They stayed ready. Act like our God is big. And kind of the final point of emphasis here is just to be ready. The work continued, and they stood guard. And man, when we face opposition, we have to stand guard. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8 talks about the enemy who prowls like a lion, that Satan's kind of looking for the weak spot to attack. We had a relative who was dealing with some health issues, and some of the folks they knew were maybe they were saying, well, maybe this is a demon possession kind of thing. And my friend just asked me, what do you think about that? And you know, it's one of those conversations that it's hard to figure out. And I sort of said, well, on one hand, that wouldn't be my first inclination. You know, there might be something else going on there. I don't know if that'd be my first thought. But on the other hand, you know, why in the world is there cancer? Why in the world is there mental illness? Why in the world is there addiction? Why in the world does all this brokenness exist? Because the enemy is real, because sin is real, and because there's always this spiritual battle going on. And so while physically Nehemiah and the workers were ready and present, don't lose track of the fact that all through Nehemiah chapter 4, they are building this foundation of spiritual preparedness that we need to have in our life, that we have to stay close and be spiritually prepared. You know, I get to this Sunday, we're having a football game going on. For the most people, to million people, Chiefs Arrowhead available to do that, thinking and praying. Ball game.
Worthy of every breath we could ever One who could ever